thesis research is focused on historical archaeology, and I'm largely working with archaeology from the city of Otatahi, Christchurch in New Zealand during the latter half of the 19th century. To give you a little bit of background, if there are people that are unfamiliar with Christchurch, it was a planned European colonial settlement established in 1850 and initially settled by contingents of English settlers. The two large earthquakes that struck the city in 2010 and 2011 shook loose, if you'll forgive the pun, a great deal of the city's 19th century history and archaeology, both in terms of how it affected the city's sense of identity amongst an upheaval that destroyed much of its visible heritage, but also in terms of a huge quantity of archaeological work that was carried out after the earthquakes. My research uses the artifact assemblage from that post-earthquake work to look at the use and availability of goods in the city of Christchurch between 1850 and 1900. And the site I'm going to talk about today, which is an 1860s to 1870s fancy goods store, is just one of the many that have been excavated there in the last 10 years. The site is huge and I cannot possibly do it justice in 10 minutes, so please forgive this very brief overview. To start with, here we go, a little history. It's no exaggeration to say that Christchurch of the 1860s would have been near unrecognisable to those of us who know the city. The swampy open landscape on which scattered houses and buildings stood was a far cry from the city that we now know. European settlement was only a decade old in 1860. In 1860, Christchurch had also only been an official city for a very loose definition of city for 4 years. To European colonists, it would have been a frontier, a landscape, in society and in commerce. There were very few shops in Christchurch itself until the 1860s. The first was, I think, established in around 1851, but by 1854 had moved to Colombo Street, just north of Cathedral Square, which is sort of the central landmark of Christchurch. And it was here, which you should be able to see in this photograph and that on the screen, that a small hub of retail stores sprang up, including among them several cobblers, furriers, drapers, pharmacists, stationers, and general goods stores. By 1864, this part of Colombo Street was a hodgepodge of small businesses and offices, and unusually these included several fancy goods stores, including the brilliantly named well-known Little Shop, which I think sounds particularly Dickensian, and is the really small building about 4 doors from the left of the image. But it also included today's subject, which is London and Paris House, the double-gabled building towards the right of the image. From the start, it's clear that London and Paris House was aiming for a sense of something grandiose. Its very name is a reference to the phrases that meant fashionability in mid-century colonial society from the latest London and Paris houses. The ambition in that name is clear when you think about the landscape in which it was established, which was so very distant from the relative sophistication of London and Paris at that time. Initially, the shop was a clothing store run by 2 sisters, the Mrs. Alice, but in 1862 it became a fancy goods store under the ownership of a man named Henry Leake, who advertised a large and general assortment of goods, which you might recognise from the title of my talk, for sale. The tone changed slightly in 1872 when the business passed into the hands of a man named Mr. Thomas Pillar. Thomas, while still advertising fancy goods, sort of expanded the range and arguably lessened the fancy brand to include ironmongery and most significantly second-hand goods. He gave up the business in 1876 when it was taken over by a man with the incredible name of Fountain Barber. These advertisements can provide us with a general sense of the goods that the shop sold, but we don't actually get much of a sense of the goods themselves, the way they looked, their decoration, the style, how they felt, how they sounded, the quality of their manufacture, all of the things that would have influenced their sale and purchase, and still which, it's how we still shop today. Fortunately for us, this kind of material impression is where archaeology shines. I should say that it's rare to find archaeological assemblages from commercial sites like shops. A shop is, after all, a place in which goods are bought and sold, not used and discarded as they might be in a household. In the life journey of an object, a shop is just a way stop. It's sort of a gateway between being made and being used. Fortunately, when the site of London and Paris House was excavated in 2017, an absolutely positively giant assemblage of artefacts was found in and around this square brick structure at the back of where the shop would have been. The structure contained at least 920 objects, broken into 7,275 fragments, hidden beneath timber boards, dirt, and buildings for 150 years. Another 4 rubbish pits around this deposit also contain material related to London and Paris House, leaving us with around 10,000 fragments of 2,000 objects from the shop in the end. And as you can imagine, this was quite the jigsaw puzzle to figure out. These artefacts provided a rich and tangible illustration of what was hidden between the lines of those advertisements from the shop, whether it's in the shape and decoration of toilet wares and personal artefacts, or the style and material of serving dishes and the teawares, tumblers, plates and decanters that were intended for someone's table. Many of the objects that were identified in the assemblage had previously never been seen in Christchurch archaeology. While people tend to hold on to and repair the objects they value now and in the past, and they would rarely make it into the archaeological record. This gold-painted lustre vase, which would have had glass pendants hanging around it to catch the light, is, for example, the first of its kind that I've seen in the New Zealand archaeological record. These fancy goods speak to us of the connections that Christchurch had, despite its new colonial status and far distant location, to the rest of the world, and specifically to those markets for which the shop was named. They also speak of the significance of those connections to the people of the early city, people for whom the best of the London and Paris houses was important. The artefacts show us the aspirations of Christchurch settlers to gentility and a fashionable aesthetic in their material lives. Some objects are themselves an imitation of gentility, like the porcelain rendering of a lace-cuffed, graceful hand holding a single tulip stem, while others show their quality through their fragility and the skill of their manufacture and their decoration, like this free-blown milk glass vase, which was hand-painted with flowers. Or this amazing cut to clear fragment of lamp glass through which the light from an oil lamp would have danced in patterns. A friend of mine refers to this as the lava lamp of the 19th century, and I think she kind of has a point. An artifact like this conveys a very different message to the straightforward functionality of the ordinary clear glass chimney lamps that we usually find. Other artifacts are just a little bit of everything, like this elaborate maiolica glazed handheld candlestick, or chamber stick as they're sometimes known, in the shape of a leaf. The stem formed the loop handle, and the candle would have sat nestled in the petals of the flower in the middle. It's an extremely elaborate version of an object that was also very plain and functional, usually when we find them. However, the archaeology also tells the story of the reality behind the London and Paris House brand. The assemblage contained many artifacts that were common, styles and forms that were cheap and readily available throughout 19th century Christchurch. Large quantities of Asiatic pheasants, brine and foliage pattern vessels, which were all very easily accessible, were found in the same rubbish pit as the fancy goods. Because this was a shop, however, there was far more variation in the types and quantities of vessels that were found, especially goods like ladles, which are extremely rare on Christchurch's domestic sites, but were present in several different patterns within the shop assemblage. This is that same distinction again between the shop assemblage as a representation of what was available to consumers, and a domestic assemblage is a representation of what has been used, broken and thrown away. They're not at all the same thing. The nature of the assemblage is commercial, shone through in other ways as well. Some of the artefacts still show the pencil stock marks or prices scribbled on their surfaces back in the 1860s or 1870s. It's a bit of a mental shift as an archaeologist to think of these objects as unused, even though they're broken, because they're goods that were interrupted in their journey from manufacturer to consumer. They never quite made it out of the shop and into daily life. Unlike most archaeological discoveries, they're not an assemblage of use, they're an assemblage of availability. And this is, at least to me, in large part where their value lies. However, they were broken and subsequently discarded, and there are a lot of accounts that describe ways in which items in a shop might have been broken. My favourite involves a Labrador that got locked in a shop overnight and burst out through the front window in front of the startled policeman. I would love to say that this was how these particular artefacts got broken, but I don't think I can. However, they were broken, and however that happened, the fact that these artefacts were interrupted before they could be purchased, before they could enter the cycle of use and discard that we're used to seeing in a household, it means that they can provide us with a perspective on the types of goods people had and the way they valued them, and what was available to them that we don't often get to see. Even though they're unused, their stories didn't end in the ground. Instead now, to me, 150, 170 years later, they tell a story that's both distant and familiar and offer a glimpse behind the commercial veil of 19th century Christchurch. And a little plug at the end, if you want to read anything more about my research or about Christchurch archaeology, I write a blog with a friend of mine called The City Remains, and you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks.